As Craig said, my name's Jess, and I'm a therapist. I work with a lot of climbers and skiers who have had accidents in their happy place. And I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation. As Greg noted, as Andrew shared, the truth of this is none of us are exempt. Even if you've never had an accident in 30 plus years of touring, we're all touched by it. And the fact is that we're all human. One day you will die, I will die, and there's a strong chance that before you do, you'll bury people close to you. And it's a tough conversation, this conversation around grief, this conversation around loss, and as a community, how we come together. For the purposes of tonight, I'm keeping it somewhat focused on death in our mountains, though I think that it can be broadly said, grief comes in many forms. There's a lot of entry points to it. And it's a larger conversation than we're diving into tonight. This photo was taken about 6 weeks ago by my buddy Finn. We were climbing and skiing Manaslu in the Himalaya. And there's a lot to say about that expedition. I'll save that for another time. The relevant part, I think for me, being a person who spends a lot of time thinking about death, was how do I prepare for an expedition where I know I could die in the mountains, and do I expect to encounter that? A climber did pass away on the mountain, and I didn't expect that it would be someone I knew, someone I had befriended on the trek in and visited regularly in base camp. I didn't expect to encounter them lowering his body as I climbed up. And I stopped and I asked one of the climbing Sherpa who I knew, who was with the body recovery operation. And I said, God, Tingy, what happened? And he looked at me with a great sadness and a lot of composure and gently said, people die in the big mountains, Jess. But you're strong, you gotta keep climbing. And I nearly lost it. Hiccup sobbing at 7,400 meters is not advised. There's a lot of reasons that hit me. And I think a big piece of that was, in reflecting, I was struck by how much like an ER doctor, the climbing Sherpa had an attitude of acceptance, of expectation and acceptance, and then reassurance to those of us who are still well. Safe to say I was not well emotionally in that moment. But I think it sort of fits with this quote from one of the Himalayan giants, Reinhold Messner. Mountains are not fair or unfair, they're just dangerous. And I think as a community we can all say, well, yeah, of course, like big peaks are dangerous. That said, it's a live question as to how we view our mountains. I've certainly been scared in our mountains. I've seen them be somewhat dangerous, but really pause for a moment and think about how you view our backyard, how you view your happy place. If you're viewing from not in the Wasatch, substitute your local mountain range. I know for me, I see our mountains as a place of stoke, of joy, of growth, of challenge. I train a ton in our mountains. I've learned a ton about myself. I've eaten so many muffins and other, baked goods. It's kind of my thing, if you ever tour with me, on a million peaks. And I think that Messner's quote often feels really far and distant from my experience in our mountains. And I think a lot of that comes from the preparation, the training, the forecasting. We live in an incredible community where we can assess risk, we can manage risk. And sometimes danger does show up. And sometimes it's not preventable. And we are human, and we are fragile. And I think part of my hope tonight is that we don't avoid that fact. I certainly want to keep the stoke train alive, but I also think this is an important part of the conversation too. How we view our mountains needs to be expansive enough to include the fact that they are also dangerous. And as a community, I think we're better equipped to handle that maybe than other communities. I don't know. I don't want to pick on any community. Squash players don't have to have this conversation, though, probably, with their partners. So I think it's a huge conversation topic, but I wanted to throw out a few notes on grief, kind of to have a common language and a starting place for this conversation with yourself, with your family, with your friends, with your touring partners, your climbing partners. The first piece I want to throw out about grief is loss is the flip side of love. They go hand in hand. And this is true everywhere, not just in the mountains. We grieve when we lose something we care about, someone we care about. And it's a healthy evidence of how much connection we had to that person. And I think that we often spend a lot of time talking about love without also saying, grief goes hand in hand with that. And as the therapist, of course I'm not going to stand up here and say, so you can protect yourself by never loving. Don't love anybody, you'll never grieve. It's not, it won't be my advice. Feel free to take that tack yourself if you'd like to. Another piece of loving is, I don't think it ends, it changes. Just like that, grief doesn't end. We've heard folks speak about losing folks, like Greg mentioned losing friends in the 90s. It doesn't go away. It changes, but it doesn't leave. We fold it into our lives. We weave it into who we are and we carry it with us. And I think a big part of what we can do as a community and as individuals is say, what meaning can I attach to this loss? How can I move forward with this person? This picture is taken by my buddy Mark a few years ago, about 3 hours after I had to put my dog down. We looked at the avalanche forecast and decided it was a safe day to point it right down the middle of the monitors. And I think it's interesting, that we also grieve in the mountains. For me, the mountains are certainly a happy place, but they're also the place I go to cope. And it becomes really difficult when you're grieving from a mountain-based accident, because all of a sudden, the place that you go to process, if you're anything like me, the place that you go to connect with community, all of a sudden has an extra layer on it. Another point I'll throw out there is that it's totally not a linear process. I wish I could give you this step-by-step advice and say, all right, we got a formula, here we go. Kubler-Ross is a psychologist and came close by describing 5 stages of grief, commonly experienced parts of it. But never have I ever seen denial move to anger, move to bargaining, to depression, and then finally you reach this place of acceptance, and you never have to go back through those other things. Rather, grief is it's a splatter effect. The image I have in my mind is just like a paintball gun. You don't know what color you're going to get of that paintball that flies out of it. And you might be feeling acceptance one morning and then not an hour later be deep in a place of bargaining, wishing it didn't happen, denying that it could possibly be happening or have happened. So I guess just by way of setting a stage, feeling all of these things at once and in all kinds of succession, it's normal. And if you're supporting someone going through grief, especially in a mountain context, being a partner means more than having the avalanche conversations or checking gear or doing the beacon check. I think being a partner means making space to listen to your friends as they go through these things, to take it to the outside, so it's not solely an inside experience. I think something that's also really relevant here is that it's okay to grieve. Maybe that needed to be said at the very beginning. I think the stoicism of the Messners, sort of that old guard, Like Messner lost his brother on the descent from Nanga Parbat, and he still went on to climb a bunch of 8,000 meter peaks after that. I don't know how he integrated that grief, but I think that's an example of some of the stoicism of yesteryear. But it's okay to grieve, and it's okay to go through these things and express them to those close to us. Which kind of segues into, well, what about community? Grief's not only a personal experience. We share it with each other. We share it as a community. Even if you didn't know any of the 6 people who passed away last year in our backyard, I imagine you were touched in some way by it. And at the very least, you probably had a sense that your own mortality was worth reflecting on, even if you didn't know anyone or anyone directly affected by loss. So grief is not only a personal experience, which brings the question of, well, what do you expect from your friends and partners? My buddies are awesome, and I expect that they will put up with me if I'm hiccup sobbing in the booter as I go up. I wasn't on this one. I was smiley for this particular picture. But I expect that I can bring forth and have those tough conversations about what's going on for me. This is a bit of a sidebar, but something we talk about in avalanche safety is the human factor. And I know emotions, especially if you're grieving, can really impact the human factor. I was so glad to have Mark when my dog died, and we really reviewed safety before skiing the monitors, a well-known slide path, because I didn't want to be in such a place of grief about my dog dying that I made a risk that was, unconscionable in our mountains as a result. So what do you expect? Have that conversation. Maybe put it out there in your pre-briefing. Talk about it with your bestie before you go. Grin at GoPros and send it. And then I think that's also part of how connection versus isolation functions. Sometimes we have our own personal encounters with grief that remain such. No one can know the depth of anyone else's sorrow. We can witness the external pieces of that. But grief is a personal process on one hand. The invitation I'd like to throw out is that it can also be a connective process. There's nothing, I think, more human than love, and the flip side, suffering loss. And for anyone who's grieved, whether it's in the mountains or in their personal life, it strikes me that one of the greatest privileges is seeing how suffering opens you up. It opens you up to the realness of the world, the scarcity of this moment being the only moment in time we have. And you can look a little differently at every other living being on this planet. And I think that is at the heart of community. Our community's growing. I've been here 10 years. I'm part of that growing. I've added to it. And I think the conversation can continue of when there is a fatality, when there is an accident in the mountains, the question of how to show up. Even if you're not the one directly impacted, can you reach out to people who are with understanding? Can you support your friends and reconnect with people as a result? I think examples of this can even come as simply as, well, I think twice before hitting submit on my Facebook post in the Wasatch Backcountry group. Can I think about how this might impact someone who lost someone? I was touched by the sensitivity I saw in that group after the Wilson Glade fatality last year. And I think as a community of people who get it, we're all skiers or splitboarders or snowmobilers, we're backcountry enthusiasts. We can get it in a way that other folks in society can't. I think that we're never going to say, well, of course you'll never ski again, or why would you go up into that dangerous place? The snow, it moves, don't you know? We're not going to make those comments. I think we can hit it on a much deeper level when it comes to support and showing up. So it's a huge conversation, but I wanted to share some resources with you all for how you can take this and keep going with it. I mean, the first one's our community. I touched on that. Think through the people you can talk to. Make a list. Who will I call if the bad thing happens? The next point there is a great interview where Steve House interviews Barry Blanchard on the Uphill Athlete podcast. Barry's been if you don't know, one of the premier alpinists from Canada. He's been a guide. He has a phenomenal conversation with Steve. Actually, part of the title came from Steve House saying, well, the mountains are my happy place. And they talk through several fatalities that they both experienced in the mountains over the years and what they've learned. The Climbing Grief Fund has a bunch of different stuff on their website. I highlight here the directory. It has therapists listed by state, and these are therapists who are climbers and skiers themselves. I get to meet with a small group of them every month, and I am so honored to be part of that crew. The Climbing Grief Fund also puts out a whole bunch of Vimeo videos where they interview different people on different topics related to grief in the mountains. I highlight here a conversation between Skye and Lorca on the topic of resilience. There's also several on there which are quite good about guiding and professional accidents, and as a guide, how you might respond if that's of interest to some of you. The CGF also put out a film about 25 minutes long called 1,000 Ways to Kiss the Ground. A lot of folks are interviewed in that, mostly from the professional community. But Brett Harrington, Lynn Hill, Alex Honnold, Tommy Caldwell, several of the Roskellys, various people who've lost close folks in the mountains and continue to climb and grieve themselves. The Mountain Muskox group is pretty neat. They're up in Canada. It's a peer-led group for support when there have been accidents in the mountains, so not just death, but also what's it like to climb again after taking a whipper and breaking both ankles, or how are you doing after surviving that slide? And they have a pretty active website with a lot of different things. And then finally, zooming out a little bit more from our mountain community, Francis Weller is one of, I think, the current great thinkers on grief, and has a phenomenal book and website with different workshops that have been recorded. He also leads different kinds of retreats. So if you're looking for more from a therapeutic lens, Francis has done some incredible work. And then finally, I didn't put myself on there, but I'm super happy to be a resource. Feel free to email me, find me on Instagram, whatever method. I think it's such an important conversation, and it never comes up at a great time, but I'm always super happy to answer an email, answer an inquiry. And yeah, that's what I've got. Thank you.
Wow, remarkable, Jess. You're really quite an amazing resource for our community, and quite the badass as well. Thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, you are where the rubber hits the road, right? You've got cred in the mountains. You've got cred helping people share this thing that we call grief. And that is a really remarkable way to balance your life. And as you said, we probably have a little bit of a different perspective, our world as opposed to a very pedestrian world. So how do you think people within our outdoor community might deal with grief differently than the general public?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that I'll brag on us. I think we do well. I think we do better in some ways. Because I think we're intimately connected with our bodies as athletes. And I think we experience the present moment on average in such a powerful way. And those are two pieces, I think, of dealing with grief quite well. Of course, I think there's always pieces like that mentality of, well, I have to be tough and I have to hold it in and be stoic, or stuff it down, or I'm not scared. You're not scared. Okay, we're not. I'm always scared, so my partners know that. But I do think on the whole, climbers and skiers and alpinists handle grief from a place of knowing the fragility of life in a way that some folks who don't have that experience might be utterly shocked at mortality. I don't know that we are in the same way.
Excellent, excellent. In terms of experiencing grief, and we experience this on different levels, you know, you said the loss of a dog, the loss of somebody close to us, the loss of our, you know, a gerbil. I mean, whatever it is, right? We experience grief at different levels. Do you have any advice or words of advice for people in our community who experience grief for the first time?
Yeah. For the first time is an interesting addition, I think, to that question. I think slow down. Because we're fixers. We'd love to fix a problem. But when the grief comes from a place of death, there's a permanence there. And we can't fix that. There is no fixing it. And I think sort of the platitudes of, well, it'll be okay, or they died doing what they love, those I think are well-meaning but not necessarily helpful. I think slowing down, sitting with something that's horrible and unfixable, and reaching out to trusted people who can sit with you in that. That's what I'd say. And I think there's probably more to say. Anyone who's lost someone can probably add their own pieces onto that as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that advice. In your talk, and at the end of it, you had some hyperlinked links that you shared, and those were obviously some great resources. Is there any way that our viewing audience tonight can access those? Is there sort of a generalized thing that you can offer?
Sure. I didn't know if folks would be able to click on the links, but they're there. So I'd say all of these are quite searchable via Dr. Google. The Climbing Grief Fund is a great starting place. If you just Google that, there will be a huge amount of resources on their website. The Uphill Athlete podcast with Barry Blanchard, also entering that into a search bar. And yeah, I think the same could be true with Francis Weller, very searchable on Google. If there's a way I can make them more public, I'd be happy to actually type out the links and send them, or let me know.
And remember, everybody tuning in tonight, you'll also be able to access this archived broadcast. So it's going to give you another opportunity to check those out as well, you know, at your own time and your own convenience. Got one more for you here. And so we want to reach out. We want to help, especially those that are grieving. We might not be personally involved in that grief. Are there any ways to best assist somebody in our community who's experiencing this?
Fair question, yeah. I think if you know the person, you might have a sense of a starting place of what would be meaningful. I think if you don't know the person, reaching out and supporting those people that you do know, or even your friends who are also not directly impacted and checking in, is very helpful. I think something that happens a lot is when there's a tragedy, people jump on it, and there's the casserole delivered, and there's a lot of activity up through the funeral or the memorial service, and then it tapers off. It's almost like it goes off a cliff if you were to graph the number of outreaches. And I think that month 4, month 8, month 12, those are the times when people might be still reeling from grief, but it's as if the world's moved on. But their world hasn't moved on yet. So I'd say be cognizant of that when you're reaching out. We have such an accelerated expectation of getting over loss, which is a horrible phrase, but we only get a few days of funeral leave at most major companies, as if that's enough. And I would encourage folks to take the long view with grief and how they support. I'd also encourage everyone to know you can't fix it. We like to do things, but there is no fixing. but simply sitting with people is powerful.